So welcome. We have a good number of people that are already watching on this webinar. Ask a Pro episode 4 with Clayton Przekop, a permit expediter guru, and something that I want to coin is the permit samurai. Being of focus and practice and precision, very precise. So I put that together on some post I did somewhere. But I really have been excited to talk to you, let you kind of share some of your wisdom as with everybody else. And for those who may be watching this in the future, I think it's going to be very insightful. There are things that you touched on that I kind of knew about. They're in my periphery, but then it was just like, oh my gosh, you can give it a lot of context and substance on how it kind of applies to a lot of us that are working through trying to get an accessory dwelling unit permitted, or a conversion of a garage done, or an attachment, or those kinds of things. So everybody, how this is going to go, we are going to have the first part of it. I'm going to do a screen share. We're going to have a few slides. Our emails, addresses will be at the end. And at the end, we're just going to open it up for Q&A. So if you do have questions, you can put them into the Q&A section as opposed to the chat. The Q&A is going to be a little bit easier for us to look at and for us to see. So with that, I shall start to screen share. Okay, and slideshow from beginning.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think just to kind of preface this, once again, for the people who weren't listening with Matt, I'm not a city employee. I'm a permit expediter. I help people, project teams navigate through the city process. I've done all kinds of projects from the tallest buildings west of the Mississippi, Wilshire Grand, Metropolis, super high-end residential, celebrities' homes, multifamily, you name it, I've done it. I really enjoy the variety. I'm actually sitting in my recently almost completed. We're working on our final right now, but I'm sitting in an ADU that we just completed. So I'm very experienced. Both I've worked on a lot of ADUs, and I've also just personally done one, and those are huge differences.
Huge.
Yeah, and so I'm excited to share my knowledge, kind of geared towards your average homeowner, which generally doesn't get this kind of expertise and wisdom.
Yeah, thank you. Again, if you guys have any sort of questions, I think there's one, so you just take it from there, and I'll try to get these things brought up just in case you don't see them.
Great. So just kind of painting in broad strokes so you can kind of understand, and this will help us later on in the future. When we're thinking of city processes, I think the kind of helpful stages to remember is you're going to submit some kind of package, some kind of information you're going to give to the city. The city is going to review it. And once they review it, they're usually going to pass you around to all the other departments, and those departments are going to review it. They're going to give you comments and corrections. You're kind of going to go back and forth with the city. Once you get everybody lined up in a row and everyone approves it, that's kind of the issuance process. Usually you have to register your contractor with the city, their workers' comp, things like that, sign a declaration that you're going to use like a approved waste hauler, and then pay the final fee. And then you get your permit issued, you have approved plans, you can start your construction and start calling for inspections. And that, in broad strokes, is the permit process. It varies a little bit from city to city, depending on bigger cities, smaller cities. You're gonna have different variations, but they all kind of follow that general pattern.
Excellent.
So I think, the most useful kind of information that I can give homeowners are when you go to the city, when I go to the city, how do I approach the city, and what are the keys to success when you're dealing with the city? A big part is getting multiple departments to agree on the same thing. That's probably one of the most dangerous problems. In the city of LA, one of the hardest things for ADUs that I see struggling is when they're in a coastal commission zone, because then you have a state agency and a city agency, and these people have different bosses, they answer to different people. So there's a chance that your project could be kind of caught in the middle there. And so that's the clearance issue. When I'm going into a project, I like to ask the city, hey, what are the big concerns? What are the things that really kill projects? And usually they'll be pretty honest with you and tell you. And if there is something like coastal commission that trips up a lot of projects, I like to start talking to them early. First thing, go to them and say, before I even have plans, hey, I'm thinking about a project. What can you tell me? And document that interaction. Because if it goes south 6 months down the road, you can say, we've been talking since September, right? And just kind of prepare yourself for the conflicts that may come up. Hopefully they don't. Hopefully you're being proactive and you're kind of preparing yourself for those situations. But always get things in writing. I know we'll get to that in a second. But it's always a good practice whenever you're dealing with the city, whenever you're dealing with a construction project in general, log everything, document everything, just for your own sanity. But it's also really good when things go awry. It's good to have documentation.
So if you have a phone call with somebody that, you want to write it down on some sort of a notebook and just say, I spoke to
Absolutely.
Steve at this time, this date, this was the topic, this is kind of what he says. So you can have those contemporaneous notes. Can't get that out, sorry. So
it depends on what it is, right? Like if it's just, hey, we talked about this, maybe I'll keep that in my personal notebook so that I can reference it later. Maybe it becomes a bigger thing. If there's anything kind of involving money or big decisions or big architecture things, I would follow that up with an email and let it say, hey, just to recap and memorialize on our conversation,
right,
this needs to be done. Yeah, so
that's what I like to do. I follow up a conversation with an email so I can have it sort of memorialized and say, if anything that I've written to you is not what you understood us to be communicating, please, offer some corrections. So you do have that follow up, and I think that that's really important, critical. One thing that I want to kind of touch on a little bit too is, and not to sidetrack this that much, but you are being involved once people have their plans in hand. They've talked to an architect, they've talked to a designer, and then you can or maybe it's with an architect or a designer, they're handing the plans off to you to say, now Clayton, go get these run through the city of LA in as fast and efficient a way as possible.
For me, it really happens in all ways. Sometimes I get hired directly by the property owner. On ADUs, typically I do a lot of bigger projects. So when I'm getting reached out to, the property owners that reach out to me usually are involved in some capacity on bigger projects, and it's kind of a referral word of mouth thing. Most of my ADU projects, I've bumped into people at the city. A lot of times I'll be at the city and I'll see the people that seem the most frustrated and aggravated. A lot of times are the poor homeowners who aren't construction professionals. They're their first or second time at the city, and they just kind of don't understand how the system works. They have a lot of unfair expectations for the city. A lot of asterisks there, but yeah, I'll tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, there is an easier way. There are people that do this professionally.
Well, it's overwhelming. Isn't it a big building? I mean, I've never been there personally.
It's yeah, so it's kind of changed. There's actually a couple buildings, but the main one's in downtown. They have several floors. Each floor has different departments. Each department has different rules. And so just, you see people get really frustrated walking up to just getting a ticket to be in the right place can be really, really challenging.
That is kind of thing. And can you talk about the different agencies? Because that's the one thing that when I first started getting into this, I had the misconception that when I went to the city to pull my permit, they would handle all the things that needed to be done. I mean that's kind of a very ignorant thought process, but I didn't know that. That's like, okay, yeah, you can pull your permit for me, it was in the city of Burbank, but then you have to go to water and power. And then you have to go over here to go get some sort of street clearance. And then, all the fire department and the school district. Can you talk a little bit about those different agencies that you see at the city of LA?
Yeah, and generally they have different names, but these agencies exist everywhere. And the question that you see, the way that this most commonly manifests itself when you see those frustrated people at the city, you'll see the employees saying, where is your issue located? Are you talking about something on private property, or are you talking about something on public land? And that's an important distinction, because if it's on private property, it's usually under building and safety. Building and safety oversees the engineering and safety components of what happens on private property. Planning kind of oversees the aesthetic and the use, how that property functions and looks to the larger community. On the public property side, you get into public works, right? And the cheat that I usually tell my people when I'm training them is think of public works as street and sewer. So public works actually comes up quite a bit on ADUs because you're adding a new bathroom. So it's very common in most cities, you're going to get a public works permit because they're saying, hey, we want to get some money for this extra toilet load and sink load that you're going to put on the system. Traffic is also in the section of public works, and sanitation. In the city of LA, probably the most difficult department, one of the most difficult departments that usually catches people from out of town by surprise is the sanitation. It's called low impact development, or LID department.
Low impact development is the sanitation department?
Well, so the sanitation department is a kind of one section of public works, and they oversee things like grease traps in restaurants. They do the trash pickup in the city of LA, but they also have an actual plan check division and the reason that they come up on ADUs is that if you create more than 500 square feet of impervious area, so if you create 500 square feet of new roof area in the city of Los Angeles, you then have to go through lid plan check. That takes an extra month. There's an extra fee. There's a covenant that has to be recorded, say you're going to comply with all the lid rules. They're the ones who require people to put in rain barrels. So on the Facebook group, when we see the rain barrel questions, that all relates to lid. And if you're not prepared, if you're not familiar and savvy in the city of LA, it can catch people by surprise. Sometimes people will forget to submit. So they'll go pull their construction permit, and the plan checker will say, hey, where's your lid stamp? And then they have to start that month-long review process. And that will hold up their permit for several months. And that's kind of where the long review bullet point. You want to make sure that you're doing all your reviews as soon as you can. You're going to planning, you're going to building and safety. Don't put off anything until the end, because that's what really hurts projects, is when there's a review that you didn't know about or you weren't aware of, and it catches you by surprise.
And each one of these entities, agencies, is going to be making comments, or they have the ability to make comments if they're just not happy with what they see.
So there's kind of two critical phases to every review. There's applicability, and most agencies will say either you're not applicable, and for ADU that happens a lot, right? Like you're not going to have to be reviewed by Department of Transportation for an ADU. It should be exempt. So they're going to first say, hey, either this is applicable or not applicable. And then the second part, if it is applicable, they're going to tell you what their standards and requirements are, and you have to comply with them.
I have somebody, Patrick, put a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to read it. It says, do you find that the city is helpful when it comes to answering questions on entries required to complete the permit forms? Some of the permit terms are technical and nuanced. I'm trying to go through the forms myself and was planning on compiling a list of questions on the various permit forms. He puts in parentheses, plumbing, sewer, etc., that hopefully the city could help me with.
Yeah. Let me preface this by saying that I have city employees in my family. I absolutely love city employees. But the short answer to your question is no, it's not easy, and it's gotten much more difficult during COVID. You used to be able to go into the city and it may take you half a day to find somebody to answer your question, but at the end of that, you would be able to. There's one phone call in the city of LA, 311, and you have to go through multiple switchboard operators. Your other option is going to one of the building and safety offices, and the lobby staff will usually tell you to call 311. They don't really like answering questions. So that is not an uncommon struggle. There's a lot of people who feel particularly frustrated trying to get that information, and that's kind of one of the things is if you're stuck at the submittal stage and you can't even get your project into the city, or sometimes what happens is you submit your project and the city keeps kicking it back. And they say you need to submit calculations, and your project architect, maybe he's stubborn, maybe he doesn't know, and saying we don't need calculations. You go back and forth. You haven't even paid your review fee. You haven't even started the clock really on your project. So in that specific situation, what I would advise you to do is do your very best. Stick a sticky note on it, provide your contact information, say, hey, I'm really sorry. I've been trying to complete this. I'm struggling. I'm happy to answer any questions or get my architect on the phone. Can you please contact me at this time? They have a screening process. Well, they'll take it in. They're going to say, hey, this is missing a lot of information. Also, for submittal, a lot of times they don't need all the information. For the city of LA, when I filled out one of those building and safety forms, which I do probably about 10 times a day, I give them the project address, the work description, and my contact information. I don't usually submit with the architect, engineer, building owner. A lot of that stuff I just omit because they don't need it until the end.
Gotcha. A question from Roger says, what is the worst case scenario for the old do it and ask for forgiveness versus getting permission for everything?
Sure. That's a common misconception. I think the worst case scenario in that situation is that you end up with a structure that you can't use. I think it's important to think about when, I'm sorry, my dog's going crazy. I think it's important to think about when you need permits. This is a conversation that I have with a lot of my clients in the beginning. If you're not planning on selling your house, you're planning on living there for 60 years, you might be able to build something. If your neighbors don't complain in the city of LA, they're probably not going to come after you until you go to sell it. And then there's going to be a problem. They're going to say, hey, that one room isn't permitted. How do we go to sell it? There are things you want to be really careful about. You know, if your neighbor complains and they're really adamant, you have a hostile relationship with the neighbor, the city can make you tear it down. That isn't a legal crime. It's going to take years. It's a long process. Enforcement is not the most efficient, but there is that risk that it could be required to be removed. So I would never recommend a client build something illegally. I would look at how to do it legally. And if you can afford to, do it that way.
I'll also add to Roger's question is that if you build something and it's not permitted, and let's say you wanted to rent it out,
huge liability.
It's massive. It's a massive liability because then if you rent it out, somebody hurts themselves, and let's say there was an electrical wiring issue. Well, then as they kind of come in and they are doing the inspection and they have an attorney and the attorney goes, well, this is an unpermitted structure and look at all of these issues. You know, I don't even think your insurance company is going to cover you. You're now liable for damages. It just goes, the list goes on, and I would not recommend anybody doing that. You know, even if it's for a family member, let's say that I was, because my wife and I are building an ADU on our property. Let's just say, as an example, we didn't do it with any permits, and we have my father-in-law is in there. Something happened to him. My sister goes, "You had dad living in an unpermitted structure." Now you have two very dynamic, very powerful, two attorneys in my case battling it out, and that just it's not worth it in my opinion, but it's to each his own. So I'm sorry I kind of went down that rabbit hole.
No, I think it's a great point. And one other thing I'll add is what you don't know can be extremely dangerous. The best example I can give you of that is in the city of LA, we have a couple very conservative departments that have very conservative interpretations. One of which is the city of urban forestry, or the Department of Urban Forestry. They issue tree removal permits, and they almost never, it's pretty tricky to get a tree removal permit. It takes quite a lot of time. And I had a client ask me that same exact question. I walked him into the office back when it was open, and I asked one of the old kind of bristly inspector dudes, I goes, "Hey, what's the worst thing that can happen if you rip out a tree without a permit?" And this guy just cited like a laundry list of $100,000 items, and he was like, "If you pull out a tree, we can make you replace it with massive trees that are very expensive and costly. You're going to have to crane them into place. That alone, you're going to have to close traffic." He said, "If you pull out a tree without permission, it could cost you $500,000, possibly more."
That's incredible. I had no idea.
So those are the things that you want to, it helps if you have a permit to make sure you're not going to run into those kind of problems.
Right. Also, Matt had a question about setbacks and encroachments from the past.
So as they relate to ADUs, setbacks are semi relatable. The big thing about ADUs, one of the great things about ADUs, that we love ADUs, and so many great people have fought really hard to get us ADUs that we can build on most properties, is that they're exempt from setbacks in the rear and side yards, usually on 50% of the lot. So you should get some relief from the city. Smaller cities don't really like that. They try and fight that. They try and put jurisdictions, extra requirements. If you're going to be in the side yard, Culver City comes to mind. You're in that situation, there's kind of an internal tension between the city and the state. And I think as a project, you want to ask yourself, do you want to be the guy who's trying to fight on the state's behalf or the city's behalf, or do you want to take the path of least resistance and do what the city knows how to approve? And I would always say, if you can, take the path of least resistance. Don't be the pioneer who does it first, because it's usually really expensive and there's not a lot of credit given to those projects, especially on an ADU.
Yes, and if that didn't answer the question, when we hit the Q&A section, we'll definitely try to cover that again too. Becca had a question. It's like, do you have any experience with helping to grandfather in unpermitted structures that have been on the property for many, many years and used as rental dwellings?
Yeah. So yeah, doing understanding what the city considers existing non-conforming or existing is an art in itself. And there are permit expediters. I have an aunt, Dion, who's brilliant, and she runs a company called Illegal Additions Made Legal.
Oh, wow.
I've known her my whole life, and that's pretty much all she does. Is first she'll start fact finding and digging through permit records. Sometimes it's as easy, the plan checker is just being lazy, they can't find a permit record, and maybe there is a permit for it. You show them a permit and they say, okay, you're out of the woods. Sometimes you're going to the county and looking through other records, kind of cross-checking records and going back and forth with the city. And sometimes you're submitting plans and getting things approved after the fact. So definitely have experience with that.
Then we got another question, a question from Roger saying he's thinking about an ADU on wheels that is small and gets brought in, hooked up to the main house for water and electric, then is rented out month to month. And if there was an issue, you just put it on the truck and then pull it out. So I know what my answer is going to be, but I'll let you go first.
I mean, I think I defer to you on this one because I think you're right. So I'll let you take that one.
So Roger, one of the things about tiny homes, and I tend to go on a relatively moderated rants about these because, and I preface this that my wife is a workers' comp attorney. She works for the employer. In your situation, she would be defending you, the homeowner, if somebody were to get hurt in this RV coded, because that's what these are. They are coded to the recreational vehicle codes, which means that they are only built to the codes to be occasionally lived in. It's for occasional occupancy, which is a big word to say. If you, as I interpret it, it is not for permanent habitation. If you were to rent out this RV to somebody, and then again, I use that example I just mentioned, somebody hurts themselves, the attorneys that are now involved, I find out that you were renting out even though it's month to month, they could be there for a couple of years. And let's say something breaks because it's not built to the standard of the way that the manufactured housing industry is, the true modular industry, or site-built, stick-built construction, which conforms with the California Building Code, also called the Uniform Building Code, and then the energy component of those codes, which is Title 24. Very highly regulated. And you have to go through a lot of work to make sure that your ADU complies with all of those particular codes in and of its own right.
And I think to put a kind of cherry on that, it raises an important point, which is why do we have this crazy permit process, which I think everybody who's doing a project will ask themselves at some point. And one key thing is lawsuits. These permits protect us from lawsuits. So if you are renting out and it's not someone that you trust with your life and your financial success, you want to protect yourself from those lawsuits. You want to have inspectors sign off. You want to have architects stamp your plans, and you want to have the city stamp your plans, because those are all levels of protection for you.
Yeah. So if you do it, if you're using RB, because I know that they are so much less expensive, and there's a reason why. So yeah. So there's just a reason why. We can cover that in a lot of detail, and I could talk about those things for an hour in and of it, just that one particular topic. So we kind of breezed past that other slide, which was basically, get everything in writing, because you had mentioned that, and I think that's critical. Also following up with a email to memorialize any sort of a phone conversation, because I always kind of stress that to people. It's like, you could have had, I talked to you about it, but unless you can kind of refer back to some sort of memorialization, then you're just saying, well, you said, and that doesn't get anybody anywhere. I really liked when I was looking at this slide, architect contracts, and people really don't talk about that. So this is going to be good.
No, and I mean team dynamics in general, right? Like a lot of people don't even understand what my job is. And the truth is that my job varies, right? I work for certain architects, and they know all the codes. They basically use me as kind of their secretary. I'm kind of a courier that delivers their plans to the city, and I schedule meetings with the city as needed. But I don't really offer much advice. I don't tell them how to change their plans or anything like that. On the other hand, I work with architects that are sometimes out of state, and I'm telling them what they need. These sheets, the city's not even going to review this unless you add these things. And they're adding, and in some way, I kind of take on a design advisory role. So what your architect does can vary on the team, but I think and you pay for that convenience. I think that's a huge thing too, right? Some people take their plans to the city and they have these conversations with the city themselves. A lot of times on ADUs, the architects just do it, and that makes a lot of sense. You might pay a premium for that, you might not, but in general, understanding these variations, what's included in your architect contract, how are you paying them? I think it's becoming more and more common for architects to charge time and materials, especially on these kind of newer projects like the SB9 projects. I talked to a couple architects who have submittals in here in the city of LA, and I was like, what are these costs? And they were like, we have no idea. We don't even get into that conversation. It's strictly an hourly contract. I think the more competitive thing is flat rate, but you have to be aware of what you're paying for, right? And also making sure that you have architects that can deliver what they're selling you, right? Look for references, look for projects. Do they have projects in the city that you're in? That's super important, because you can't necessarily build what you can build in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. So understanding those differences is key to delivering a project. And also it cuts down on the work for them. I've seen architects where they go into the city, they misinterpreted the code, they misunderstood for whatever reason, best of intentions, and then the city basically tells them that they have to move the entire project, right, and change the height and basically redesign the whole thing. And the architect's in hot water because they now have to pour all this time into a project that they weren't budgeting for. And I've seen it happen a lot, actually, where change orders go out in the middle of a permitting process, which
the change order is usually like, give me more money.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. Hey, the city threw a curveball at us, therefore we're going to charge you double to design this project. And in an ideal situation, the architect should know that going in, right? They should have the experience. They shouldn't get that curveball. It's hard. This is a tough conversation to have, because even with the most experienced project teams, things go wrong, right? I've been doing this for 10 years. Things catch me by surprise, but you should have, not everything should catch you by surprise on every single project. And that's what you want to guard yourself against.
No, I think thank you. That's a very good explanation. Let's see. So the one thing I think with a lot of people, just like with a permit expediter such as yourself, the true role of architects is sometimes hard to understand, because with accessory dwelling units, they think that they're just a small, they should be as simple. It should be simple to do. It shouldn't take that much time. But when you're complying with all of the local and state jurisdiction, whether it's the local jurisdiction or the state's requirements, it is very cumbersome.
So I love talking about this stuff. Both my parents were architects. My dad went to Stanford and my mom went to SciArc. So I talked about architecture at the kitchen table ad nauseum. And both my parents are kind of on the opposite sides of the architecture spectrum. My mom is very much a modern pencil sketch or napkin sketch architect. My dad was basically a structural engineer and loved very technical, recreating historic styles. And so they're two completely different people who basically had completely different jobs, but had the same job title. And so that's a very common question. What is an architect? It's similar to an expediter. It can vary on the project. The way that I like to describe this to people is classically, architecture is the designing of arches, right? In medieval history, Roman history, creating an arch was an art. It was a sacred art form. So you had to have an expert to tell you what kind of arches you could create, what the span is, how the engineering works. Nowadays, we have standardized materials. You don't necessarily need a wizard. You don't need an arch on every project. You don't necessarily need that complex engineering. Architects have taken a role for a long time as kind of project leads. And they kind of oversee the GC, they oversee all the different trades, the structural, the civil, they make sure that everything comes together in a good package. And that's kind of classically what an architect is. But I'll tell you from experience, there's a lot of teams. I mean, there's a couple people that I know in the city of LA that are structural engineers, and they do ADUs all by themselves. They have a civil they work with, and there's no architect involved. But that structural engineer takes that job captain position. And I get hired as project management, where somebody comes to me and says, hey, Clayton, we want to build something. We want to go hands off. We want you to manage all the contracts and deal. We're happy to pay you that premium to deal with it. And I'll hire the architect, I'll hire the engineer, I'll schedule the meetings, and I'll essentially run the project. So you need a team lead. That person can be the architect. It's not always the architect, but on ADUs, it's really great to have an architect.
Thank you for that. And that's kind of touching on a question that I think that Patrick just posted, which is if you pull permits as an owner builder, but hire the licensed and bonded general contractors to do the work, would the owner bear the brunt of any issues and liabilities in the future after the ADU certificate of occupancy is issued, or would the GC share some liability? It is his understanding is that at minimum during the course of construction, liability would be shared with the GC prior to project completion.
I should preface this by saying that I'm not a lawyer. And I think at that point, you're speculating on what's going to happen in a lawsuit, right? That to really understand the answer to that question, it's going to be what happens at the end of a court battle. But pragmatically speaking, I think what you're describing doesn't necessarily make sense, because if you're pulling the best reason, in my opinion, to pull a permit as an owner builder is to save money, right? Because you're not using a licensed contractor. If you're pulling a permit as an owner builder and you have a licensed contractor, it's kind of the worst of both worlds. But I think what you're hung up on is getting the contractor registered with the city. So what I would do is reach out to your city plan checker, your building plan checker, and say, hey, we got this permit issued and then we hired a contractor. Is there any way that we can attach their name to this permit? In the city of LA, you pull a supplemental permit anytime you change contractors or you change from owner builder to contractor, and they capture that contractor information. So then if something should happen, you know, the city has a defense that there was a licensed contractor, you have a contract with the contractor, you have multiple levels of kind of safety there.
I'll also add, Patrick, is that acting as an owner builder, you know, I see people do that a lot here in Burbank where I'm at. And if you are hiring a licensed, bonded, insured general contractor that has workers' comp insurance and the whole 9 yards, And you've also been named as a certificate holder with their certificate of liability insurance. It's called additionally insured, which is critical. There's a couple things to be able to look at this, and in addition to what Clayton just said, is that you have a set of plans that are going to be for either your conversion, your addition, or your detached ADU. And those plans are going to have to be stamped because so somebody owns those set of plans. And then that means that all of the engineering and all of the calculations that are on those plans, they are saying that this complies with the state codes. The general contractor is then going to have the responsibility. Let's say you're doing a framing contractor, or let me back up, a foundation contractor who's going to dig out the footings, pour the concrete, and follow those plans to the letter. And so if there's a problem with that, then that's kind of on him. If the inspector goes, he didn't do that right, he's going to come out and kind of make that notation. So there you do have some level of coverage. The biggest thing that I see personally is between an owner builder and hiring a GC to do the whole thing and working with an architect. Ryan O'Connell says hiring the A team. And hiring the A team usually starts with an architect who then coordinates, make sure that everything's going to be compliant, coordinates with the general contractor, make sure that everything is ordered in a timely manner. We did not order our windows in time, so we're going to be delayed about a month. So we'll get to a little bit more of that in just a minute, because I think it's important to be able to do that. Let's see, George asked a question, and we're getting a bunch of them, Clayton. It says, so let's do this. I don't want to skip too much over to the questions. I will wait till the end because we'll have a more focused time. But if you can talk about the permitting costs.
I think this is huge. This is one of usually my advice on permitting costs pays for my entire service fee, and projects usually save money by hiring me because I take the time to understand the permitting costs and tailor a project. So for example, in the city of Los Angeles, permitting cost is based on a multiplier of your construction valuation. So if I was submitting this ADU, I say, I'm planning on spending $20,000 to build this ADU. The city has a special equation. They run that $20,000 and they say, okay, your permit fee is $5,000. In the city of LA, they have a valuation table that's from 2015 and it's absurdly low. I think for residential additions, it's like $150 a square foot. So if you go to the city with an honest evaluation or what your contractor is telling you you're going to pay, you're probably going to pay 25 to 50% more on your permit fees because you're not taking the time and shoring up your project to make it as small as possible from a permit fee perspective. The other common way that permit fees are calculated is square footage. The city of LA's, it's usually either valuation or square footage. If a city, very common question, how do you calculate your permit fees? If they say valuation, I say, how do you figure that valuation out? Do you guys have a spreadsheet? Do you take my word for it? Because if you take my word for it, let me tell you, it's going to be a really optimistic budget. The other main answer or process is square footage, and inquire, how do they calculate that square footage? Does it include patios? Is it all covered areas? From city to city, in city of LA, it's all covered areas. In West Hollywood, it's all conditioned areas. So
it could be, covered areas is like a patio. It's not enclosed habitable space.
Correct.
So
understanding these differences, measuring from the inside of the wall to the outside of the wall on a big project can make a big difference. So kind of understanding these things, having that conversation with your architect, hey, how are these permit fees calculated? Are we going in with an application that's going to be mindful of that?
Yeah, and I think that is very, very important. And I hope people understand just how complex these things are. I mean, because we're tight, and I've been doing, property development for a very, very long time. And I've been in the ADU world since its inception. And I still find things that I am not 100% clear on regularly. And I have to lean on a lot of people like Clayton to kind of go, okay, how do we address this? How do we get through this? And I think that it's important to be able to know what you know and know what you don't know. So
Absolutely.
So, we do like to be mindful. So for those of you who are not here from the How to ADU Facebook group, we try to be very mindful that we're not doing much, if any, self-promotion of our own companies. But in case you have any questions for either one of us, here are our email addresses. Feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to talk to you. And with that, I want to kind of dive back into the Q&A. We got about another 15 minutes. I think it's going to be kind of fun. Whoops, sorry. So I'm going to stop share so I can pull these guys up here. And it says, when the city makes a decision, this is from Matt, when the city makes a decision that stops the RTI on a project, are they obligated to inform you in writing?
So just a little background for everybody not in the city of Los Angeles. RTI is ready to issue, and that is essentially the official approval from the city of LA. So a lot of times you'll get an RTI and you won't be ready to pay permit fees or go into construction. So the RTI is kind of your halfway permit. And he's basically asking, if you're not getting your RTI issued, are they required to issue something in writing? Technically, yes. This is where you get into the weird world of mannerisms and peculiarities of city employees. And a lot of times they don't like it when you suggest how they should do their job. But I've been in that situation. You're talking about your last plan check, right? You've been in this process for months. You're so close. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And for some reason, you just can't get the final approval. And you're trying to get something in writing. And for some reason, that offends the city. And that's one of the most uncomfortable and difficult situations to be in a permitting process. And I think you got to stick with your gut. Be really, really nice whenever you can. Say, hey, I'm just trying to understand the problem. Be as neutral as you can. Can you please put what we need to fix in writing, because I'd like to have my permit issued. If they can't comply with that, get their supervisor on it. Say, hey, no offense, I just don't feel comfortable leaving this situation or this meeting. Can we have your supervisor weigh in? I'm trying to and say the same thing to them.
And I think that you said this to me before, you just mentioned it again. You have to be professional. You can't really lose your cool. And even though you feel like you want to, it is just really important just to understand that they're just doing their job, that they think that they are obligated to do it. And so asking for, politely, professionally asking for a supervisor is a way to do it. The other part of it is I'll add, is with accessory dwelling units, and you touched on also SB9, like the architects just don't really know how to really go about SB9 because it is brand new and it is very controversial. And there are a lot of jurisdictions and COGs, government entities, groups of cities that are getting together under the Southern California Association of Governments. And then you have COGS, which is the Council of Governments, that usually combines certain cities and jurisdictions to act as one, as that they're looking to make some amendments and changes to SB9. I think SB9 is wonderful because you can split your property into two and it's ministerially approved, which means you just have to comply. Can you touch real quickly on the definition of ministerially approved?
Sure. So the opposite of ministerial is discretionary. So I think it's probably easier to understand the definition of discretionary, which is basically approval that has some kind of discretion or subjectivity. So common types of things that, another word or synonym for ministerial is by right. So a by right project is basically you have to comply with code, and then it's black and white. It's approved. The community is not going to show up with pitchforks and torches and say, hey, we don't like that ADU, don't build it. It's not subjective. It's objective. They will issue the permit. On the discretionary side, if you propose a project, the community has input. The city has input. They can say, hey, we don't like this project. You're not going to build it. They can say, hey, make it half the size. But ministerial essentially means that it's not up for debate. The problem that I think a lot of people get into is ministerial doesn't always mean quick. And I think that's one of the big things with SB9 is it takes a long time to record a map. It's like a multi-year process and it's expensive. And SB9 allows you to draw the map, but it doesn't really help you do it faster or more cheaply. So it's still going to be tricky to do.
So your experience or your thought looking forward is that an SB9 lot split could take a very long period of time.
2 years. In the
Wow.
city of LA, 2 years, you're going to pay a civil 20 to 30 grand, and you're going to pay another 20 to 30 grand in city fees. So you're looking at close to 100 grand in soft costs in 2 years of your time before those properties are two separate properties.
That is astonishing. So yeah, let's make more housing more affordable. That is not it. Gosh almighty. Matt had a question. Have you experienced AIAs that love to argue with the city because they can bill for those interactions and make them more profitable?
There's all kinds of different reasons, but yeah, I mean, you should be conscious of people going too long on their billable time. I think a lot of people are intimidated. Some of my best customers drill me and they say, how long do you think this is going to take? Sometimes I can't answer that question. I say, I'm not, if you want me to give you a hard number, I can't do it. But I usually have a reason for that. If it's a project that happens a lot, if you have an architect who's doing a lot of ADUs, they should probably be able to give you an idea and stick fairly close to it. I think I'll talk about my dad personally, because he was one of these kind of difficult architects. My dad was a hard ASS of an architect, and he made everybody on the projects team really interesting. And he got the projects on time and really critically, but could he have probably been a better people person? Yeah. And sometimes certain people get into it. Sometimes it happens to me. Sometimes I'll get into a tiff with somebody at the city. They'll rub me the wrong way, and I need to go to somebody on the project team. I'll go to the architect. And sometimes it's a full-blown strategy. Sometimes we go in and say, hey, I'm going to be the bad cop. I'm going to be the guy really pushing against whatever the city wants. And the architect has all the power to make the concessions. They're going to be the good cop. So in that kind of situation, I would have a word and just say, hey, you're being really combative. Is there any way we can not do this? And if there's a way to kind of work around them, circumvent them to get that positive back and forth with the city, that's always best.
Yeah, and I would also add to that what Clayton just said is that if you're interacting with somebody at a, and it doesn't matter where, it's a county or it's a city level, and they're just not interpreting the ADU codes the way that you think that they are written or should be enforced, you can always contact the Housing and Community Development in Sacramento. So it's a state agency of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. So HCD, they have a ADU program. They have an ADU handbook that they're updating. It should be out really soon. And they're basically the ones that are kind of regulating and helping jurisdictions interpret what the codes are. So if you think there's an obvious kind of that doesn't make sense, take what they're saying. Let's just try to figure out a way. Somebody that you're working with or yourself, if you're an owner builder, can reach out and try to get that clarification. It is very often that the HCD will look at it and see that there is some sort of a discrepancy with what the plan check person is making notes on. They will communicate with them. Even though they may be breaking the law, they will say, hey, we want to help you understand it. So they're going to try to be they're going to try to make it as cooperative as they can. And that kind of leads me to the next question. This one's from George. It says, can you talk about some useful strategies for an owner builder who are interested in doing as much of the work as possible? And George, I think that's a really great question because, it is expensive to do an ADU. My wife and I are doing a full GC build. It's going to be between $250,000 to $275,000 for a 734 square foot, 1 bedroom, 1 bath. It's not. These things are massively expensive. So an owner builder, you can save, 15, 20, sometimes 25%. But Clayton, even though you may have a different perspective, what would be your advice to somebody that wants to try to coordinate all the different general contractors and the design and strategies?
I would really advise you against it. I mean, that's really the short answer is it's a ton of work, even if you're an industry professional. I was thinking before going into this meeting, I was thinking about successful projects. There's a guy who I know who is a director for a huge project management firm, and he kind of did everything himself. But that guy's managing 20, multi-million dollar construction projects. He has subcontractors that owe him favors for the next 3 weeks. He had guys lined up to do every single job as it was ready to go. And it was still really uncomfortable to work with him for those 6 months that he did that job, because he was extremely stressed out, even as an industry professional. So I would say, look really hard at what the value is of doing it yourself, that 10 to 25% versus the project taking twice as long. How stressed, and what's that cost impact to you? The project costing extra, because things inevitably will come up, and they're going to come up more if you're not an experienced builder. So you kind of know that going in if you're going to run the jobs and run the guys. If you're absolutely committed and diehard, I would say get references from people you know. It's really hard to schedule labor right now, so your full-time job is going to become scheduling. It's going to be impossible to work a full-time job and manage
Agreed.
when it's in the middle of it, because it's so hard to get labor at the right time. Get great references. Don't allow anybody on your property that you don't trust and you don't have good feelings about. And God bless you.
Yeah, and I'll add, because Clayton and I definitely do have two different perspectives on this one, is that, and I'm also an advocate of hiring the A team, which basically you mean you have a point person and that they handle all that kind of coordination. But money is money, and you want to get this done. Our case, we're doing it for my father-in-law. So if you're doing it for a family member, I was on a call today. Somebody's doing it for their mother, and it's just east of Sacramento. And they need it done sooner than later, because they're spending, I think, about $10,000 a month in an assisted living center. And like, okay, let's get mom in an ADU in our backyard, and where it was a married couple, and one person was going to be able to have time to assist them. So I understand it. The owner builder component, you have a lot of things you need to be able to do, because now you're hiring the individual trades and you're having to schedule, like Clayton said, but also critically, you're having to ensure, as Clayton said, don't let anybody on your property that you don't know. I will take that a step further. Don't let anybody on your property that is not covered by an insurance policy of that general contractor or that company. Because if anybody steps onto your property, is going to be doing any work and injures themselves, that's where you're opening yourself up to massive liability. Coordinating things. I just mentioned a moment ago that we didn't order our windows. When we were talking to our GC, he's like, have you picked out your windows? Like, no. He goes, well, you should have done that a month ago. So we trot ourselves down to the window store, and it's 10 weeks. So my ADU will be done. Yeah, it'll be done.
On this one too. And on a big project, there's a person who just does what's called acquisitions. But that's a thing that happened here on a big project, on a good project. You should have a spreadsheet of the decisions that are required from the owner and when the deadlines are on those decisions. You should also be talking to whoever's running your project on a regular basis, whether it's weekly or daily, depending on your involvement, right? The more you're going to pay them, ideally, the more they're going to do on their own, the less you have to check in on them. But you should be, hey, when you talk to the contractor, are there any decisions that you need from me? And when do you need them, right? Those are super important questions, and put the ball in their court so that if something comes up, it's leverage, right? And you could say, hey, maybe something came up and it was expensive, but you caused a delay here, right? And you're trying to kind of negotiate your way to keep your project on time and on budget.
Yeah, and I think that you just said something I think is very critical that I don't bring up as much as I should in discussions and conversations with people. It's like, ask the general contractor what is expected from you as the homeowner who's building it. Like for me, I did not ask that question to the GC. He probably assumed that I knew, because I'm in the business. And I'm like thinking, well, I kind of knew I needed to order my windows because everybody's saying how long they take. Well, that thing just came and sat down right in front of me and on my lap and said, guess what? You got to deal with it now. And it was just like that. Oh man, I missed it. So
then it's the cascade, right, of all the other things that it triggers, which is it's a lot of stress to manage a construction project.
It is definitely a lot of work to be able to do that. Question from Matt says, touch on this. Do you advise a professional being involved as a project overseer, keeping an eye on all angles of the project from contracts to subs to city and construction sequence of events, and keeping subs from endless add-ons?
I think, yeah, there are that successful ADU project that I mentioned. There's the guy is a director of a project management firm. And I didn't know about this for a long time, but these firms, they basically manage all the contracts. They take bids from all the contractors. They vet out who's qualified and who's the cheapest, and they do construction management. I also think it's not a one size fits all, right? If you're managing a ton of construction and you have a ton of work, those kinds of solutions start to make a lot more sense. If you're somebody who watches H hours of HGTV and you want to be intimately involved in your construction project, maybe you don't want to pay an extra 10 or 15 grand for someone to take away and give you all that convenience. So I think it kind of depends on, one, your workload, and two, your desire to actually do the work yourself.
Yeah, good answer. So I want to jump into this one from Liz, because you were the first person to really talk about SB9. One, how long it's going to take. You said you're thinking 2 years, and then the soft costs. Holy hell! And that's massive.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things. So like, it's fun to watch single family homeowners go through what the industry goes through, because it's not often that you get these new laws that affect every single family home, but the code changes and the city implements these new processes almost every year, and we're constantly relearning what can be done and how it can be done. And so one thing that's important to remember in this kind of status is the state or the city is going to release a law, and people are going to duke it out in court. Not only is it going to take right now the cities are trying to figure out how to interpret the state law and how to implement it, how to enforce it. But as soon as they kind of start doing it, inevitably, I would be shocked if projects didn't get sued at some point. And then those court decisions are going to weigh in to how that process happens. So right now, based on what I know, BOE hasn't made any concessions on their map reviewing, which is where I get the 2 years from. That may change, but it'll probably be a couple years until it all settles out and there's kind of one solidified process.
And the civil engineer component of it.
It's huge. So this kind of goes into requirements, is understanding that an architect draws plans, but a civil engineer gives you the boundaries. And so if you have plans and you don't have boundaries, your plans may have problems. So that's always something good to keep in mind. A lot of architects don't work without a boundary survey because they don't like to run into that issue. The civil engineer on a SB9 case is kind of similar. Anytime you're creating new lots, the county assessor has a map of all the properties on file, where your property line ends, where the neighbors begins. When you redraw that line, you have to submit a very accurate official map from a civil engineer to the city and the county. And that review and approval of that map as it gets incorporated into the county's records is the longest part of that process. It's really tough.
So SB9 is, as I have said, and I've kind of been a little opinionated about this, is not really the save all or for people that want this to do it. Oh, that's great. That's going to be wonderful. And it's not necessarily the big evil manipulation by Sacramento to increase density and on all the neighborhoods, because it's going to take forever to do, and it's very, very expensive.
It's also important to remember that SB9 is where ADUs were 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So nobody has really figured this out quite yet.
No, I think so too. We're just at 3 o'clock, so we just want to take about 1-2 more questions at the most, and then we'll kind of wrap it up for people. Is what part of the construction process requires a licensed professional? And referencing electric, plumbing, and what else? The person, he says that he has some construction experience in other jurisdictions and would like to do some of the labor himself.
I mean, this kind of depends on how much money you have and who you're willing to hire. I would personally work backwards, and I would say electrical and plumbing are the things that personally scare me the most. You know, if you're going to burn a house down, it's going to be from something electrical wrong. It's also really expensive to do those trades, to cut through the walls and things. Framing is fairly inexpensive. You can do brute labor yourself, but the other thing is you're going to have to get inspected by the city. So if you're not feeling confident in getting an approval, it's probably going to be less expensive to hire somebody to do it. But the short answer to your question, electrical and plumbing.
Yeah, and I would also add to that is the state of California says that if you pay a person more than $500 for a job, they need to be a licensed general contractor of some sort. And you can get into some very interesting areas where you're hiring people and they hurt themselves and then they sue you. One, you have to have course of construction insurance on your project regardless. Two, if you are hiring somebody to do it that is not licensed, you understand the risks that you are assuming personally, and then that you're going to be putting onto your property and any sort of assets, resources that you have as an individual or held with another family member, like a spouse. Those are really important. So, and I will definitely support what Clayton said about the electrical is critical, plumbing is critical, and I think that the foundation is also pretty important to make sure that it's level and all of the right tie downs are in the right place. I mean, these are things, if you have construction experience, you can do, but just make sure that you really research it. I will refer to the How to ADU Facebook group to kind of post those questions, kind of get engagement from both Clayton and myself and hundreds of other professionals. I know we're going to be losing a few people, and so we're going to wrap it up. Liz, thank you very much for the compliment that you sent. So Liz basically said, great job. And the question was, do you think there's going to be many reviews of the entire subdivisions as a result of SB 9? And I would, before Clayton answers that, chimes in, I think that there's going to be a massive review of SB 9, because there's legislation, there's things that are being done right now to try to get it removed. They don't want to have SB 9 making these changes to our neighborhoods. No, don't change the texture of our neighborhood. We don't want it. So there's going to be some fights just within, the state legislative body itself. There's also going to be, as Clayton has mentioned, there's going to be some litigation against. It's like, I want to do it. I interpret it this way. You need to allow me to do it. So there's going to be a lot of things happening on SB 9. And as we look at very pro-housing assembly members and state senators that are in Sacramento right now, working with a governor who is also very, very pro-housing, pro-density. So there will be a lot of changes that happen with that. Clayton, I want to say thank you very much for your time. It has been wonderful. We will make this webinar available to people to watch. We'll post it on my company's website. We'll also post it on How To. We'll post it in a lot of places. And if you need any information or just to have a conversation with Clayton, please reach out. The man is a true professional, and I want to thank you for your time. Everybody that put in their questions, thank you very much for being part of Ask a Pro. And stay tuned. Next week, we're going to be loaded up. We have an estate planner who's going to talk about some other issues, and we're also going to have the head of HCD, Greg Nicholas, who's going to be joining us on a special Ask a Pro webinar on Friday, the 18th. And that is going to be that's going to be one you don't want to miss. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Clayton.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.